Okay, great. I think our guests are now visible to all of you. Welcome to our guests. Good morning, everyone. We're very pleased to have with us Leonardo Garnier, the Special Advisor of the Secretary General on the Transforming Education Summit. He's on your left screen. And on the right screen, you can see Stefania Giannini, UNESCO's Assistant Director General for Education. And they will brief reporters on the forthcoming policy brief on transforming education. I believe you should have received advanced copies of that, they will talk about that just now. Mr. Garnier, over to you.
Thank you. Good morning. Following up on last year's Transforming Education Summit and building towards the Summit of the Future, this policy brief we are launching today lays out a set of proposals aimed at creating inclusive and truly learning societies and to understand education as a global public good. The brief starts by recognizing that education faces both a crisis of equity and access and a crisis of quality and relevance. While millions around the world are still excluded from education, many of those who do attend formal schooling are not even learning the basics. Current education systems are not preparing them to understand and confront the complex challenges of the future, the rapidly changing world of work, the digital revolution, the global climate crisis, and the increasing polarization in society. This is compounded by the fact that current educational investment is not only insufficient, but highly inequitable and inefficient. It is in that context that we submit to the consideration of the UN member states this brief with the following set of principles and proposed actions. First, we must move away from the traditional static vision of education and towards adaptable, learner-centered, and effective lifelong learning systems in order to create truly learning societies. Second, ensuring equality and inclusion in and through education. Schools must become more inclusive, safe, healthy, and stimulating learning environments that support equality and inclusion for all, especially those often marginalized or excluded, such as rural populations, low income households, migrants, refugees, and displaced persons, and people experiencing discrimination on the grounds of disability, ethnicity, religion, sex, sexual orientation, or gender identity. Third, making curricula and pedagogies effective and relevant. This calls for a learner centered approach that achieves foundational learning and develops the capacity for creative, critical, and scientific thinking, digital literacy, and social emotional skills. Curricula must be relevant for today and for the future, with a particular focus on education for sustainable development and fostering a culture of civic responsibility, peace, and respect for human diversity. Fourth, transforming teachers and teaching. We must reposition the role of teachers from passive to and unilateral purveyors of information into active and inquisitive guides of their students' learning adventure. For that, we must improve their working conditions, ensuring fair pay and a fulfilling and engaging professional experience. Fifth, harnessing the digital revolution. We must ensure that both connectivity and high quality curriculum relevant digital content are available to all learners and teachers. We also need to strengthen the capacity to effectively leverage digital tools for evidence based and increasingly independent learning throughout life. We must develop a public, open source digital commons in line with the proposals contained in the policy brief on a global digital compact. Sixth, investing more equitably, and more efficiently in education. Governments must abandon short term thinking and reframe their approach to financing of education as a crucial investment with high positive externalities and significant medium and long term returns. Most countries must increase public revenue to open fiscal space so that they can allocate at least 6% of their GDP and 20% of total government spending to education and increase public per capita investment in education. These resources must be allocated equitably, reaching the most vulnerable, and used efficiently, ensuring effective and relevant learning outcomes. Finally, seven, increasing international cooperation to transform education. Education is a global public good whose provision and quality affect us all in a world ever more connected through markets, technology, and immigration, as well as affected together by climate change, war, and refugee crisis. As promised, ODA should increase from zero point 0.7 to 0.7 of national income, and the share of aid for education to 20% of all ODA. Financing the challenges of education in emergencies, crisis, and post-crisis situations. The international community must also facilitate developing countries' capacity to invest more in education by, for example, delivering the Secretary General's call for an SDG stimulus, reforming the international financial architecture, accelerating efforts to strengthen global tax cooperation, and dealing with the debt crisis. We also need policy coherence from international financial institutions, particularly as it relates to restrictive fiscal policies and public sector wage constraints that directly curtail educational investment. Summing up, this brief argues that transforming education to create a truly inclusive learning society is critical for building a more just and sustainable future, and this should be our global responsibility. Thank you.
Uh, Thanks very much. And now we'll turn the floor over to Stefania Giannini, UNESCO's Assistant Director General for Education.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. And as my colleague Leonardo Garnier just mentioned, the policy brief provides actually clear vision for the transformation of education, the transforming power of education, reflecting actually dual concern. On one hand, addressing the learning crisis, which was already pre-existing the COVID-19 pandemic and which has been exacerbated by the COVID, and the policy brief provides interesting data on this side. And the second has to do with the relevance of the development outcomes of education, and this is about transformative education, which has to lead to fundamental changes in how we think, we act individually and collectively. So now the question is, what about next? And I will focus on this process that it's the follow-up to the Transforming Education Summit last year, and which is clearly also mentioned in the policy brief. First of all, it's about moving from a culture of reforming education systems to a culture of transformation. And this means not simply change by incremental steps, rather than better version of existing systems. Transformation must result in education systems different from today. And this vision was further elaborated through the multiple tracks of consultation around the Transforming Education Summit initiative last year, which is behind, so to say, of the policy brief itself, both at country and at global levels. And the TESS call to action provided initial directions for transformative actions, locally grounded by the 140 national statements of commitment which member states provided last year, in relation namely to the following main topics: the digital and the green transitions, the need to move to a different model of financing education, better and more, gender equality, and ensuring the right to education in crisis situations and conflict situations. Well, the policy brief clearly outlines the challenges and opportunities of translating this vision into action at both national and global levels. And about next steps, the upcoming SDG Summit on the 18th and 19th September this year will be an important moment to showcase the concrete steps that are being taken to transform education. The High Impact Initiative on Transforming Education will mobilize a coalition of both front-runner countries as well as international partners to serve as the vanguards and the front-runners, so to say, for transforming education worldwide. The High Impact Initiative event, featuring exemplary country actions to transform, will pave the way to the 2024 Global Education Meeting, where we will take stock of progress made since the movement started last year. All this follow-up process is being developed under the auspices of the SDG4 High-Level Steering Committee as a concrete expression of the UN working as one. And it's now focused on a set of flagship activities to ensure the effective follow-up of the tests, including what the following I'm going to mention. The dashboard of country commitments and actions to serve as a monitoring and accountability tool for how countries and also partners translate their commitment into action. And the dashboard will be launched at the High Impact Initiative event next month. A SDG4 Knowledge Hub is being developed as a global one-stop shop for countries and partners to access and contribute SDG data, policy documents, research reports, good practices, tools, and all country-level progress on a unified online platform. And this should be a big progress in terms of having a clear vision of where we are in terms of the acceleration to SDG 4. Then the Global Youth Initiative, which will take forward the recommendations of the Youth Declaration launched at the summit that the young people actually deliver to the Secretary General himself. The three new SDG4 benchmark indicators developed around digital learning, greening education, and youth engagement, which are not included in the SDG targets and benchmarks. And finally, the Global Education Financing Agenda, which is another important pillar of the process, which includes the creation of a dedicated multilateral financing of education initiative. So these multiple efforts will feed into the Summit of the Future next year. And as the summit will represent a critical milestone in global development, this policy brief serves to guide and to position the transformative education agenda as the heart of our collective efforts and related also to the development of our common agenda. Over, thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to now turn the floor over for questions. Edith Lederer.
Thank you very much on behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association for doing this briefing. My name is Edith Lederer from the Associated Press. I have two questions. First, when you said that countries should have a goal of spending 6% of GDP on education and 10% of federal spending, how close are they to those numbers now? I'm guessing that they are probably very far away. And secondly, having been here when the SDGs were adopted, I recall that the key education goal was to ensure quality secondary education for every child. I don't think we've even gotten to quality primary education for every child. Could you comment on that? Thank you.
Over to you, over to our guests.
Okay, let me start. First, the idea of pushing countries to invest 6% of their GDP and 20% of their spending, these indicators reflect the 6% of GDP, the national effort, what percentage of your national income you invest in education, and the 20% of spending reflects the government's effort in financing, and those are, of course, indicative figures. Right now, there is a huge variety. Some countries are achieving this goal. Many other countries are not achieving it. And so one of the things we are doing, and this comes from the summit, is to insist not only on these percentages, but also in the goal of increasing the investment per person they are doing. How much is it that a country invests per student or per person in school age? And here the differences in the world are startling. You have countries that are investing $12,000 a year per person. You have countries, low-income countries, that are investing $300 per person, and the poorest countries are investing $50 a year per person. That's $1 per week. So yes, the effort that we have to make in terms of financing of education is huge, and this relates to your second question. Uh, yes, the goal is to have quality secondary education for all, and the crisis in education and the reason for the summit of last year's summit and for this effort we are making is that, one, we are not still reaching the quality secondary education for all, but as you said, we have also seen that for many of those who are in primary school, and enrollment rates in primary are relatively high in most countries, but the learning is not there. So we must make sure that every boy or girl that goes to school also learns what he or she has to learn. That's part of the goals of what we said at the summit and of this policy brief.
If I
Ms. Giannini? Yes, over to you.
Sorry, yeah, no, just complement very briefly these 2 points from my side. I think another important component of this global reflections on how to increase and support financial education for the future and for unlock the potential of the transformative model that the summit was actually proposing is very much about also better financing. So there is a financial gap, as Leonardo mentioned, and a huge divide, I would say, between the global south, for sure, especially sub-Saharan African countries and the rest of the world. But there is also a question of at country level when it comes to domestic financing that we have to keep in mind it represents globally 97% of the budget allocated to education. It's also a question of having a more effective investment, and that's why we are discussing also with ministers of finance and not only ministers of education. And this is a huge step ahead. The second point, yes, sure, quality secondary education is one of the target. The question is that SDG 4 is promoting since its launch in 2015 a lifelong learning dimension for education. And that's why it's so important that the quality of learning, whatever the level of education, is the real goal to achieve. And all these transformative targets that we are talking about and we are following up to translate into action are inspired by this principle. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mariam?
Thank you so much, both of you, for the briefing. As you mentioned, the quality of education is very important. I have a question about Afghanistan, but I'm going to ask that second. But my first question is also about Afghanistan. It's about quality of education. Ever since Taliban took over Afghanistan, there have been many reports that even in boys' schools, the curriculum has changed dramatically, and they are focusing on more teaching the kids all these radical ideologies. How worried is UNESCO and the Transforming Education Summit about countries like Afghanistan or the quality of education that is more focusing on radicalism? Also, another question about girls' education in Afghanistan, and you mentioned secondary quality, the secondary school quality. How does countries like Afghanistan fits into the agenda as this, where girls are not even allowed to go to school? And Afghanistan is the only country in the world where girls are not allowed to go to school and get education in the secondary schools or universities. Thank you. Any of you can answer the question. Thank you.
Thanks. Please, back over to our guests.
Possibly I can start at this time. Thank you. And then Leonardo, you'll take the floor. I start from girls' education and the local authorities banning actually at university level more recently, but also from all other levels and secondary of education. And not by chance, as you maybe remember, we dedicated in New York last year, this year in the 24 January, the International Day for Education to make the case strongly and loudly as one UN, UNESCO taking the initiative to to advocate for education as a right, which has to be given back to girls all over the world, especially in a country like Afghanistan. So we are very keen to follow closely through advocacy, of course. That's part of our role, and to tireless not giving up to make the case, and also in a more concrete way on the ground, reaching out to girls and young women through community-based schools, which can provide education somehow, despite the system officially doesn't allow them to go to school. So there is, and this is something which is UNESCO and the UN system, UNICEF within the cluster, working in some 20 provinces this year and reaching out to some 40,000 learners. 60% out of them are girls. Of course, it's a question of scaling up. It's a question of mobilizing more resources to make also other tools effectively reaching out, especially the rural zone. For instance, there are local radio channels that can be, in the meantime, we are trying to fill the gap, the good tools to ensure education. Then the point of curriculum and the approach of the local authorities is also very much related to the role of UNESCO to promote and advocate what we call in SDGs targets 4.7. That means having an approach to global citizenship and using education as a tool to counter all these different forms of discrimination. Of course, there is a responsibility of local authorities and governments, whatever the country, and this is something that cannot be directly addressed, but continuing to promote our model of learning and teaching, and I think that including curriculum development, and I think that all the topics that we discuss and we relaunched last year, the Transforming Education Summit, are very much also related to this crucial function of the 4.7, the core, the transformative core of SDG 4. Over.
Okay. Anything from you, Mr. Garnier?
Just a few comments. I think that as Maria was saying, Afghanistan is the most extreme case of exclusion of girls, but also, as she said, of promoting a curricula that moves away from the current challenges of human rights in the world. I think the pressure from the international community and from the UN system is critical here. However, I think it is also important to learn from these extreme cases and to realize that no country is immune to these tendencies to radicalize education. The first time one reads a book like The Handmaid's Tale, you think it's fiction, and then you start seeing even advanced countries forbidding books in schools because they talk about slavery, about gender equality, or women's rights. So we all must be on guard for the most extreme cases like Afghanistan, but also for these tendencies arising in many other places.
Thanks. Yes, please, you.
Hi, I'm Abigail. Thanks for briefing us. I'm curious what you think the best way to integrate socio-emotional learning, especially in crisis-affected areas, is when there may be a stigma against learning about mental health.
Maybe
Yes.
Stefania is better prepared than myself for that.
Yeah, no, sure. Well, we think that socio-emotional learning is a critical component in all context of crisis, conflict for sure. But broadly speaking, I think if there is a lessons we learn through the pandemic is that schools are not simply places to learn. They crucially have this function, of course, but they are very much places where children, learners have to unlock their human and social potential. That's why this is a part of the transformation that is very much already concretely translated into action. I can give you a concrete example, what we are doing in Ukraine, where there is a conflict ongoing still, of course, and where it's not simply providing learners and teachers with the devices and all the tools that can ensure continuity of learning despite the difficult circumstances the country is living, but also supporting both teachers and learners to socio-emotional tools that can give them competencies and that can equip them to address trauma and difficult situations. So I do believe that more than ever since 2020 we understand that we need an holistic approach to learning and to education. We need health and safe and healthy environment for learning as the precondition to reach out to well-being of children and teachers and consequently to improve learning outcomes. And this brings to the role of education as a more complex process than simply providing basic and technical skills.
Thank you. Are there any?
Just to add that,
Yes. Yes,
yeah,
please.
that something that UNESCO has emphasized since the law report was that in the things that education has to teach especially young learners, is learning to live and learning to live together. Sometimes when we say education, we think only of the academic part of it, but learning to live together is one of the most difficult things we have to learn. And in crisis situations, this becomes even much more important. So learning to play, learning to share, learning to solve problems collectively is one of the main priorities in crisis situations. And this demands a much more difficult effort from teachers who require the support of parents, of the community, and of other government institutions. So yes, it's very important to understand that when the situation is a critical one, you have to adapt education to confront those challenges of the moment.
Are there any further questions? Okay, Edie.
Does UNESCO have a policy on educating preschool children, and particularly on teaching them tolerance for race, religion, sexual orientation, gender, color, everything.
Ms.
Yeah,
Giannini?
thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. Well, we have a policy to promote the relevance of early childhood education. Last year, member states adopted a milestone declaration, Tashkent Declaration, in the World Conference for Early Childhood and Care. And within this context, among other priorities, one priority was still is one of the objectives to achieve through the roadmap that the declaration actually provides member states with is still socio-emotional support to early childhood education. And this includes also all the dimensions that my colleague just was referring to, of course, which is the living together, the tolerance, the approach to values the way to since the very beginning of life to accept differences and this is very much the UNESCO roadmap, but also includes all the other components which are also related to gender equality and the program that we are developing and that we call comprehensive sexuality education is addressing these topics.
Maybe I'd like to add it's sort of a personal comment on this, but when I was Minister of Education in Costa Rica and we were introducing a curricular reform in civic education, and we were talking about the importance of tolerance in those programs. And then we came to realize that as important as it is, tolerance is not enough. If I say, for example, that I tolerate Stefania, that doesn't sound very nice. So what we did, and it worked very well, was to introduce the idea of not just learning to tolerate differences and diversity, but to learn to enjoy diversity, to enjoy the immense human diversity and in its manifestations in the schools, with the classmates, with the people that works in the school, in the neighborhood. So enjoying diversity, I think, is the basis for really learning to live together.
I think that's a great note on which to wrap up this press conference. So I would like once again to thank our guests, Leonardo Garnier and Stefania Giannini. Thanks very much, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. And we'll be back with our new briefing guest.